Hi, thanks for joining us today. I'm Karen Ruebens.
And I'm Geoff Smith, and we're both Paleolithic archaeologists working at the Max Planck for Evolutionary Anthropology here in Leipzig.
We have set up this talk as an introduction to the topic of Neanderthal hunting, reviewing current lines of evidence for different Neanderthal hunting strategies, covering both the stone tool record and the associated animal remains. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please write them in the chat and we will get to them after the talk. I will give a bit of an introduction, then Geoff will talk about the fauna, and then I'll come back to the stone tool record. So Neanderthals occupied large parts of Europe and Western Asia from circa 300,000 to 40,000 years ago, a period known as the Middle Paleolithic. Across this large spatio-temporal range, hundreds of find spots with stone tools and faunal remains have been recovered, allowing us to reconstruct their behavior. In the second half of the 20th century, Neanderthals were seen as systematic scavengers, taking advantage of prey killed by carnivores, with systematic hunting seen as appearing only later with the arrival of Homo sapiens. Over the last decade, this view has been challenged, and it is now generally accepted that Neanderthals were skilled hunters that regularly killed medium and large-sized animals. And this is based on several lines of evidence, which I'm now briefly going to discuss. Firstly, zoological analysis of the animal bones found at Neanderthal sites repeatedly show that they had primary access to the carcasses. This is clear because cut marks made by stone tools during butchery, like these ones here, are observed on the bone surfaces under carnivore marks, such as this tooth pith left by a carnivore on a reindeer phalanx, and this shows that a hominin butchery took place first. In general, Middle Paleolithic assemblages show lower proportions of carnivore modifications, much lower than you would expect from a scavenging accumulation. And it's also possible to look at the age of death of the animal remains, and the resulting mortality profiles repeatedly indicate a hunting strategy targeted on prime-aged, large and medium-sized animals. Secondly, the diet of an organism and its position in the food chain can be reconstructed using stable isotopes. This has been done for several Neanderthal fossils, and the results repeatedly indicate a high position in terrestrial food chain. As you can see here, this is a Neanderthal, with ratios slightly higher than carnivores found at the same sites, like hyenas, wolves, or foxes. So these isotope analyses confirm the zoological record that large herbivores, such as reindeer and horses, formed an important part of their diet. Thirdly, archaeological discoveries of wooden spears have been made. The most uncontested evidence are the 9 wooden spears from Schöningen, a site in Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, and these have been found among the remains of at least 20 horses. It's important to note that these spears were not equipped with lithic projectiles, and this is something that we will come back to later. So by combining these 3 lines of evidence, we can now say that it's well established that Neanderthals were capable hunters. But the question that remains is, can we reconstruct their hunting strategies in more detail? First, a brief word of caution in relation to site formation and taphonomy. At an archaeological excavation, we are dealing with a situation like this. This is a photo from a Middle Paleolithic archaeological layer at the site of Jonzac in France, densely packed with bones, as you can see here, bones, all pieces of bone, some teeth, and packed with stone tools, these ones here. Going from this to reconstructing Neanderthal behavior is not without problems, and it's not always easy to distinguish the involvement of Neanderthals versus carnivores in the recovered animal bones. A predominant human input can be inferred from a combination of factors, such as a rich presence of lithics, a poor presence of carnivores, the occurrence of cut marks, diaphyseal cracking for marrow extraction, and traces of burning. And when we look at the Middle Paleolithic assemblages with these characteristics, it is clear that Neanderthals were capable of exploiting most of the herbivores in their environment. Nonetheless, the vast majority of Middle Paleolithic faunal assemblages are dominated by horse, bison, reindeer, and red deer. and the focus on these species is the same in the time periods directly before and after the Middle Paleolithic. We have made a schematic map of the main species that occur at Middle Paleolithic sites, and as you can see, there is some regional variability. For example, the inclusion of wild ass in Eastern Europe and ibex in some of the more mountainous regions. And this map gives a good first impression of the types of animals Neanderthals were hunting, but obviously there are further variations spatially, temporally, and altitudinally. So how did they acquire these animals? Hunting strategies vary according to a number of factors. Firstly, there's the number of hunters. Are we dealing with an individual hunter or a larger setup for cooperative or social hunting? Secondly, there's the number of hunted animals. This could be a lone animal, for example rhinos are solitary animals, or an entire herd, resulting in a so-called mass kill event. Then thirdly, there's the hunting technology, and for the Middle Paleolithic, there seems to be mainly wooden spears or stone-tip spears, and the question if they were used in close-range encounters by thrusting or by throwing to kill at a distance. And this leads us nicely into the last factor, the used killing tactics. There is a range of possibilities, including the selective focus on a specific species, ambush hunting, which is when animals are herded into parts of the landscape which could function as natural traps, such as a depression or a blind corner. There's the interception of prey along a migration route, and animals could be tracked, stalked, and chased. Or their presence could be anticipated at a watering hole, as is shown on this beautiful reconstruction of the hunted horses at Schöningen. There are loads of possibilities, and different hunting strategies were most likely employed within the same Neanderthal group. We will now zoom in on one of these hunting strategies, the selective hunting of one species. Several Neanderthal sites have faunal spectra heavily dominated by one species. This can include aurochs, bison, reindeer, and red deer, among others. These monospecific assemblages have been reported more frequently from Western Europe and from late Middle Paleolithic contexts. The hunting behaviors underlying these single taxa faunal spectra are still debated. Do they reflect a deliberate focus on one species, one or multiple hunting events, or are they merely a reflection of the available biomass? A famous example is the Neanderthal site of Salzgitter-Lebenstedt in Germany, dated to around 50,000 years ago. The fauna is heavily dominated by reindeer, as you can see here, with a representation of over 70% of the assemblage, and representing at least 86 reindeer individuals. Detailed zooarchaeological analysis suggests a Neanderthal origin for this reindeer accumulation. And one of the projects we are currently setting up is to do zooms analysis on the unidentifiable fauna from Salzgitter. Zooms allows to taxonomically identify small bone fragments, and this would allow a more detailed picture of species representation and test the idea of varying depositional histories between the species. The potential of zooms for discussions on Neanderthal subsistence will also be discussed by our colleague Virginie Ciné-Mathieu at their last seminar session early December, so something to look forward to. Neanderthals also regularly acquired other animal species, as you can also see already here. And these rarely dominate the faunal assemblage. And Geoff is going to briefly discuss a few examples now.
Firstly, there's the hunting of megafauna. Megafauna refers to animals over 1,000 kilos and includes species like woolly mammoth, elephant, rhino and hippo. Megafaunal remains are quite regularly found within Middle Paleolithic faunal assemblage, though only at a few sites do these species predominate. These are mainly located within northwest Europe. The role and importance of such megafaunal species in Neanderthal diet remains debated, and it seems that they had a flexible approach with a core focus on large mammals, and they combined this with the occasional exploitation of megafaunal species, and this could have allowed Neanderthals to adapt to a constantly fluctuating climate and changing environments. One of the most famous sites for Neanderthal exploitation of megafauna is Cotte de St Brelade. Located off the northern French coast, the site is situated within a granite ravine formed by two pinnacles, which we can see here. Two levels contain large, well-preserved faunal assemblages, dominated by mammoth with occasional woolly rhino. The position of the site led to the interpretation that these layers represented deliberate drives of mammoth with isolated rhinos into this ravine, and they were subsequently butchered and processed by Neanderthals. Now, this was based largely on age and sex profiles and spatial orientation of the bones, along with some isolated cut marks on mammoth tusk. My reanalysis of the site confirmed human butchery of these mammoth remains, as we can see here on this scapula. But I also identified butchery of other herbivore species and also cut marks on other carnivores, like this chop mark here on a wolf and here on a bear. Offshore mapping of the submerged landscape illustrates that the site is situated at the head of a dead-end valley, suggesting that the animals may have been driven up this valley rather than over the cliff. Mammoth and rhino are not the only dangerous animals that Neanderthals encountered. They competed with a range of carnivores for resources, and at a range of sites we have evidence for the exploitation of various carnivores like lion, wolf, brown bear and cave bear. Cut marks on these species show that they were processed, and reconstructions of the season of death of cave bears in particular suggest that they were killed during or soon after they left their hibernation. It appears that these animals were exploited for their fur, meat and bones. In contrast to this dangerous prey stands the exploitation of small game. Now, this is defined as animals under 10 kilograms, such as rabbits. The exploitation of small game appears to vary in intensity across the Neanderthal range. Overall, most of the sites that preserve evidence of small game exploitation are concentrated in southern Europe. There are obviously issues concerning the taphonomy of such remains, as many non-human predators, such as carnivores and birds of prey, can introduce these small animals into archaeological sites. That said, the presence of cut marks, marrow fractures, traces of burning indicate there's some type of exploitation, and these have been found on a range of small species including rabbits and hares, beavers during interglacials, marmots, various bird species, and occasionally fish and marine mammals such as dolphins. This low intensity of such species within the Middle Paleolithic record seems to suggest that these animals were not exploited on a regular basis, but overall further work is required to quantify the use and importance of these species in the Neanderthal diet. So what technology did the Neanderthals use to hunt? A variety of data seem to indicate that Neanderthals were mainly thrusting spears at animals from close distance. First, several aspects of the Neanderthal upper limb and upper body morphology, as well as patterns of head and neck injuries, are consistent with the idea that they regularly and forcefully thrusted spears at close range. Second, the morphology of the spears themselves is most consistent with their use at close quarters, though recent experiments with replicas of the Schurlingen spears also indicate their potential effectiveness as throwing weapons. Thirdly, only a handful of hunting lesions have been identified on Middle Paleolithic animal bones. There is a debate as this is due to their actual absence or due to taphonomic and identification issues, especially related to the fragmentary nature of many Middle Paleolithic faunal assemblages. Importantly, the recent identification of a hunting lesion on a fallow deer from the German site of Neumont Nord is most consistent with injury caused by a close-range thrusting with a wooden spear. This opens up a range of other questions which are much more difficult to reconstruct based on the current archaeological record. How did Neanderthals position themselves within a spear's length of their prey? How did they prevent the animal from escaping before successfully thrusting the spear? And how did they prevent themselves from getting injured themselves?
Okay, so this leads us to the question, how can stone-tipped spears be identified in the Middle Paleolithic archaeological record? But first we need to ask the question, why use a stone-tipped spear? What are the benefits of having a stone weapon tip rather than just a wooden spear? And there are several hypotheses for this. Firstly, some people suggest that the stone weapon tip could leave a wider, deadlier wound. Secondly, it has been claimed that a stone-tipped spear can be thrown over a longer distance. And thirdly, the loss of the point in the carcass makes it easier to recover the shaft, and it's easier to make or resharpen a stone tip than an entire wooden spear. So how can the use of stone-tipped spears be identified? Hafts made of organic material are rarely preserved in Paleolithic contexts. But we do have a range of evidence for hafting across the Middle Paleolithic. For example, we have preserved bits of birch bark, pitch and bitumen, which were used as a type of glue to attach the stone points to the wooden hafts. This is an example of a stone tool which was found in the Netherlands, dredged from the North Sea, and as you can see, this preserved birch star on this stone tool, which is a really exceptional find and was dated to about 50,000 years ago. And then here is a reconstruction of how this lithic could have been attached to a wooden handle. Secondly, several use wear and residue analysis indicate the presence of remains of plant fibers, resin and ochre on the proximal portion of points. And thirdly, morphological modifications in the lower part of the points also suggest that weapon tips were shaped to be able to fit into a wooden haft. So there's clear evidence that Neanderthals hafted some of their tools, but evidence for hafting does not equate evidence for use as a hunting weapon, since the stone tools could also have been attached for other functions, such as cutting knives. So how can we identify that an actual stone tool was used as a weapon tip? This is a very difficult question with a complex research background and many different opinions and methodological approaches. Firstly, it's important to point out that assemblages with larger proportions of pointed stone tools do occur in Western Europe, but are the exception rather than the rule. A wide range of methodologies has been used to identify Paleolithic weapon tips, and I'll give you a brief overview of the most common ones. It is generally assumed that when a lithic point hits an animal target, at some point the lithic point will break. Experimental studies have allowed to distinguish between a range of different diagnostic impact fractures at the tip of a projectile point, and here you can see some examples of these different types of breaks. These are all diagnostic of impact, but cannot be linked exclusively to weapon use. Some of the breakages could occur due to napping, dropping or trampling, and it's therefore important to assess the frequency of these impact fractures across an assemblage rather than interpret individual signatures. Based on a literature search, I made this map with the main Middle Paleolithic assemblages in Western Europe for which impact fractures have been identified, published and linked to projectile use. As you can see, there are examples from both early and late Middle Paleolithic contexts, and usually it only concerns a few examples, as assemblages with larger numbers of points with projectile damage are sparse, as you can see reflected by the size of these dots. Obviously, there are different types of Neanderthal sites, like hunting stations and more residential localities, and we should not expect to find lithic points at every Middle Paleolithic site. But taken into consideration the hundreds of Middle Paleolithic find spots that exist, the number of sites with claimed projectiles in Western Europe is rather low. Two microscopic techniques are also commonly used to identify the use of a point as a projectile, namely use wear analysis and residue analysis. Use wear analysis studies the edges of stone tools to identify microscopic traces of impact or hafting, such as polish, scarring or striations, as you can see on these photos here. There have been several studies in which they compare use wear signatures on pointed and non-pointed artifacts from Middle Paleolithic contexts, and interestingly, they seem to conclude that the use wear signatures are similar, and they proposed that the points were also used in butchery activities. Residue analysis aims to identify remains of plants and animal tissues on stone tools. There are a few examples from Middle Paleolithic contexts. For example, at Abri du Marais, it has been claimed that the presence of wood fragments confined to one end of a stone tool, you can see them here in close-up, may represent the remnants of a haft, although currently this still remains a bit speculative. Certain morphological characteristics of a lithic point have been interpreted as adjustments to facilitate hafting, as you can see here with these removals, to thin or reduce the width of the bottom part of the point so it can go into a wooden haft. And again, it needs to be stressed that none of these signatures alone are enough to indicate the use of a lithic point as a weapon tip. So far, the predominant focus of these studies has been on individual artifacts, and studies at the assemblage level are sparser, mainly due to their time-intensive nature. And this is something I'm currently trying to do with my Marie Curie project. I want to assess from an assemblage level what the role of pointed forms was in Neanderthal stone tool assemblages. I want to map the occurrence of a series of morphological characteristics across both pointed and non-pointed blanks, including these type of basal modifications, and see if the points stand out, if they were somehow treated differently. And actually, it hasn't been that easy to find European assemblages to apply this methodology to, since, as I've said, points are not that common across the European Metapaleolithic, let alone assemblages with enough pointed forms to facilitate quantitative analysis. And one of the assemblages that stood out is the site of Abri-du-Marat in southeastern France. The lithic material from the upper layers of the old excavations at Marat have been assigned to the Neronian, a lithic entity defined by the presence of points with ventral retouch, so-called Soyon points. And as you can see, there's slight retouch along the edges here on the ventral faces of these points. I analyzed a large sample of pointed and non-pointed blanks and recorded a series of attributes which previously have been linked to projectile use. So there's attributes relating to hafting and there's attributes related to impact damage. And the results show that the pointed artifacts are made on the longest, widest and thickest blanks. Basal modifications are very uncommon, although basal retouch is more common on the pointed blanks. The Soyon points are made on a variety of blank types, including Levallois, discoidal, and also do not stand out in terms of basal or tip modifications. These analyses are ongoing, and Marat is a key site in discussions on Neanderthal hunting, and we're very happy that Marie-Hélène Moncel will give a more detailed talk on this site in our next seminar series on October 28th, so make sure to log in for that too. With this review, we hope to have shown the complexities of reconstructing Neanderthal hunting strategies. As shown, there was a consistent focus on large and medium-sized ungulates. Scavenging is practiced by all large-bodied mammalian carnivores, and it was very likely also done by Neanderthals, though this does not seem to have been their primary mode of subsistence. It is most likely that Neanderthals employed a range of hunting strategies, and these were heavily dependent on how the local terrain could be exploited, like the type of vegetation, the presence of water bodies, and certain topographic features such as caves and canyons. Disadvantaging prey and ambush hunting is more successful with larger prey, since smaller animals can more easily escape. And maybe this can partly help explain the dominant recurrence of these large herbivores. Currently, there is a large body of evidence indicating that Neanderthals were skilled hunters, used wooden spears, and were able to haft stone implements. However, the use of stone-tipped spears in Europe remains enigmatic, mainly due to the mere sporadic occurrence of lithic points with identifiable impact damage. The exact mechanisms, tactics and techniques underlying Neanderthal hunting events will still form a main topic for research the coming decades, and Geoff and I see three main avenues for future research. Firstly, there's the topic of the low occurrence of hunting lesions in the Metapaleolithic record. Are these really absent, or are we just not identifying them due to the fragmentary nature of the Metapaleolithic faunal assemblages? Secondly, there's the question of the occurrence and spatio-temporal spread of stone-tipped spears. Were these commonly used by Neanderthals all across their range, or only occasionally? And thirdly, can we reconstruct the mechanisms underlying the observed behavioral variability in hunting strategies? Why were they focusing on a certain species, or using a certain hunting technology at a specific site, region or time period, and not at another? With new methods such as use-where analysis, GIS edge damage analysis, zooms, and compound-specific isotope analysis, we think it is an exciting time with lots of potential to obtain further detailed insights into Neanderthal subsistence, and that is also why we thought it was timely to organize this seminar series on Neanderthal hunting. So thank you for your attention, and we want to emphasize that this review was based on a large body of published literature, and we have added a list with main references to the recommended reading page on our seminar series website. So thanks again for logging in today, and we'll be happy to answer some questions now.